Albanese will defend the property bubble at all costs. Martin North, John Adams, in Interest People. Hi, John. Great to see you in the studio again.
Hi, Martin. How are you going today?
Yeah, pretty good. So just after the election, the dust is settling, and the question is, what happens next?
Yes. We've done a couple of shows over the last few weeks in the lead up to the election, and so all we can say is the Australian people have spoken. To be honest, not the result that I had hoped for, and even in terms of what you were hoping for, we were hoping for a shift away from the major parties to the minor parties, and to some degree we've seen that with some of the Teal independents being elected. Even though I used to work for the coalition, I actually think it's a healthy thing that the Morrison government has lost, because it was riddled with scandal, and there was just so many poor policies and poor public policy outcomes that it was time for a number of these people who were a waste of space to go. And the fact that Mr. Frydenberg has lost his seat, that is a silver lining in the whole repertoire. But the key, I think, essence of today's show is really just to reconfirm with our audience, Martin, that a number of the concerns that we've been expressing over the last few years, but also particularly in a couple of weeks ago when we talked about where we think interest rates, inflation, and property prices are going to go. I think a lot of those warnings and forecasts are still intact. So I don't see anything changing with the outcome of the election. And we're going to go into, we're going to give some additional context as to why we think that is the case.
And I guess, my observation is 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 is roughly how the electorate's voted. So Labour got back in with a very small relative proportion of the vote, actually. So it maybe wasn't so much a popular vote for them, but it was a sort of an anti-vote for the other side. And of course, the fragmented third parties, now they're a part of the makeup. It'll be interesting to see whether they have any cards to play or not. But I'm not sure that anything really has fundamentally changed.
No. And when we go to the essence of what we've been talking about since 2018, which is the debt bubble, in our property show 2 weeks ago, what we said was that the decision about whether to raise interest rates and cause a crisis and cause property prices to go down, or to save the bubble by printing more money, this is ultimately a political decision. And one of the points that we made at the last show was that there is a consensus between Labor and the coalition in terms of these policies. Now, yes, we have a few more Greens elected, both in the Senate as well as in the House of Reps, and we have these Teal independents. But do I think that any of these new people into the Parliament will have a different set of policies or different set of philosophies compared to the status quo? I dare say that they won't have anything different, but I guess time will tell.
Well, they may be sort of pushing a little bit more on the climate change angle, but in terms of fundamental economics and neoliberal thought, all of those things, I've not seen any evidence of anything other than same old, same old.
Yes. So just to recap for our audience, what we said in our property show was that rates would go up. And even as today, some of the banks like Westpac have announced a whole host of increases in some of their long-term fixed rates. So we are seeing this environment of raising rates, and we have the RBA meeting in 2 weeks, and Westpac, the chief economist Bill Evans, has actually put out a note only last week saying that rates should increase by 40 basis points, which would be quite a shock, because in the last couple of weeks, as I've been talking to people in the property market, and I said, are you aware that the banks are calling for 40 basis points? They were in complete shock. And I don't think a lot of the people in the market are ready for that. I think people are expecting 25 basis points, and that's what banks like CBA are recommending. But if there is a more aggressive push on short-term rates, that's going to have a dramatic impact on the market, at least in the short term.
It's interesting that New Zealand, of course, announced a rate increase this week, and they went up by 50 basis points to 2%. And they also signalled more rate hikes ahead. And Adrian Orr basically said, we've got to do this because we have to stop the inflation getting out of control. And already we're seeing house prices in New Zealand sliding significantly, momentum in credit growth reversing, and all sorts of things. So in a way, I think you could look to New Zealand in terms of the next few months. However, interestingly, in New Zealand, people are now suggesting that, again, rates will go up and then perhaps come down later. So it'll be interesting to see.
Yes, and then when people look at the US bond market, a lot of people are now signaling that the long-term rates have peaked, and the market is now already. So when we talk about the pivot, some people are saying that the pivot has already been is already in, because the bond market has sort of priced interest rates at a particular level, and they are coming back down. So obviously we said rates are going to go up. Pause. They'll come back down in terms of 2023, and then we're likely to see negative interest rates. But in theory, by 2024, if APRA's sort of guidance is if APRA's guidance is any measure, and then we can see property prices go a lot higher in a couple of years' time. So that's what we said a couple of weeks ago. So just to give a bit of additional context to in terms of the new Labor team. So we obviously have the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese. We have the Treasurer that's been sworn in, which is Jim Chalmers. And we have the Finance Minister, Katie Gallagher, who's also the former ACT Chief Minister. So this is the nucleus of the team that will be making the key economic decisions and obviously guiding the cabinet as to all of these important aspects of debt, inflation, interest rates. But I just want to bring the audience's attention to so Jim Chalmers, who's the new treasurer, who's been making a number of public statements in the last couple of days since he's been sworn in. In 2013, he wrote a book called Glory Days, and his background is that he, during the GFC, was actually working for Wayne Swan. So for a period of time, he was the Deputy Chief of Staff, and then I think by about 2010, he became the Chief of Staff to Wayne Swan. So in 2013, he wrote a book, and here's a key quote from the book, quote, "Hundreds of thousands of Australians were spared the unemployment queues, and families and communities escaped the listlessness and hopelessness of mass unemployment and social breakdown. In doing so, Australia dodged the devastating carnage that was wrought on the suburbs and towns of its last recession in the early 1990s. So Jim Chalmers was the architect of the Rudd stimulus with Rudd, Swan and Lindsay Tanner as the finance minister. And he, in this book in 2013, is defending it and saying that it was the right thing to do, even though the consequences of the Rudd stimulus package, and obviously this is not just the Australian response, this was a globally coordinated response. Without that response in 2008, 2009 by Rudd, we wouldn't be in the situation where we are now. So they inherited a cost of living inflation problem from Howard. They inherited a growing property debt bubble that Steve Keen was warning about in 2006, and 2007. But what do they do when faced with the consequence of mass unemployment? They save the bubble by driving the country into huge amounts of in terms of debt. And that response is kind of part of the motivation why I went to work for the coalition in 2012, 2013, because I just said it was the wrong response, and now we've inherited a worse economy compared to where we were in 2007. And unfortunately, what the coalition did when they got elected with Abbott in 2013, they made it a lot worse. Whereas what we had hoped, particularly in opposition, was that we were going to make it a lot better. So I'm not here to be an apologist for the Liberal Party. I mean, they have been horrendous in government, and they've blown up the bubble in terms of smithereens. But this issue of keeping people in work, keeping people in their houses, and stop working people from starving. So this is not just modern politicking. I think the one thing I want to get across to the audience is that this is a way of thinking inside the Labor Party for more than 120 years.
And it's been there a long, long time, and not just the Labor Party here, but other parts of the world too. I guess the other point, John, is that the quantum of the stimulus used for the global financial crisis was a lot smaller than the quantum thrown at the most recent crisis through COVID, right? By a huge factor.
Precise, that I would agree with. Yes, but still, even at that point in 2008, 2009, it was a very large stimulus package. And again, so remember, and we're just going to get onto this very soon. So in 2009, when they did the stimulus package, the last recession was actually 91, where they actually did pop the bubble. Yep. But before that was the Great Depression. So Labor. So think about it. Labor in the Great Depression wanted to push stimulus, and they basically got thrown out of power by the United Australia Party. Then they actually did pop the bubble in 1991 with Paul Keating, and we'll talk about that soon. And then when they faced this problem again by Kevin Rudd, they went back to what they wanted to do in 1930-31 because it was even in Jim Chalmers' view, it was the right thing to do. So now the other aspect that I just want to call out here is the Finance Minister, Katie Gallagher. So previous to me moving back to Wollongong, I lived in Canberra for 7.5 years, so I lived under her political leadership, but she became the Treasurer in the ACT in 2008 and the Deputy Chief Minister. And then she went on in 2011 becoming the Chief Minister, and then she retired from ACT politics in 2014. So she was basically running the Treasury benches in the ACT government, which is to some degree a glorified local council, given that it's a small geographical area, for 6 years. And the one key point about Katie is that she ran significant deficits over those 6 years, and she blew up net debt for the ACT in that period by about $1.2 billion. Now, $1.2 billion doesn't sound a lot like in today when we're close to almost $1 trillion worth of federal debt, but for a local principality like the ACT to incur $1.2 billion worth of debt over 6 years, that is a big thing. So when we think about Albanese, Chalmers, and Gallagher, they are inflationists. They believe in minimising unemployment. They don't know how to balance the books. And one of the other key things I learned about today is none of them have ever worked in the private sector. So Chalmers and Albanese, all of their life they've been in politics, in political offices, working in various Labor political offices or unions or in terms of research centres, etc. Now, Katie Gallagher started in the public service in the ACT, and then from there made her launch into politics, and now she's the federal finance minister.
And so you'd say probably Keating was more veering towards the Hawke neoliberal sphere, right? Whereas Albanese is more on the other side of the equation, right?
Yes. So that's another important point. So during the recent election campaign, there's been a lot said about Albanese being a economic research officer in the Hawke government. So Albanese worked for a left-wing Labor minister called Tom Uren, and both his minister as well as Albanese opposed everything that Hawke and Keating were doing in terms of the economy. So even though Keating went down a particular path, Albanese and his colleagues on the left completely were opposed to this. So when we think about, I guess, the history of Labor, but also these individuals involved, it's all pointing towards not letting the financial system collapse, keeping the bubble going, keeping the illusion going, trying to keep unemployment low, and to stop people from suffering significant levels of involuntary unemployment and all the social consequences that come from that. So when we put all this together, Martin, what we said 2 weeks ago about that this is ultimately a political decision about what we do with the debt bubble and property prices. Yep. What I think is the election makes no difference. We have a new government that's pretty much dedicated to keeping the show on the road. Whereas I would probably say the coalition, because I've spoken to people in the coalition, they did it because of short-term political consideration. Because when I spoke to them about deflation, popping the bubble, having a depression, and resetting the economy, their retort was always, if we do that, we can't win an election, even though I think they're wrong. But when it comes to Labor, there is the short-term political consideration. There's obviously institutional pressure from the banks and people in the financial sector who'd be pushing the politicians not to do this. But then there's also a rich tradition and philosophy that is going to be governing this new government. And obviously for those people out there who are making decisions in real time about whether to, in terms of fixing rates or variable rates, or whether to get into a mortgage or to buy a property or sell a property, understanding the history of Labor and the history of these three individuals, which is Albanese, Chalmers and Gallagher, I think they're very important factors in whatever economic decision you make going forward.